Hi, welcome to this online event for the 2021 Sheffield Chamber Music Festival. Just before I get on to talking to Paul Lewis, I just want to say a big thank you to the audience over the last year. It's been a very difficult year for all of us, of course, and your generosity in the online concerts that we've done has made all the difference. So all the events are free to whoever wants to watch them. So any donation you can make is very well appreciated. And the details of how to donate will be underneath the window that you're watching. And so thank you very much for that. I am joined here by Paul Lewis. My name is Tim Horton. I'm the pianist in Ensemble 360. Paul probably needs very little introduction, but for those of you who don't know who he is, he's one of the world's leading pianists at the moment, and I'm proud to say a sort of long-time friend of mine from school days. And I just thought I would start, Paul, by asking you, we'll get onto the specific program you're playing in the festival in a moment, but just something that might interest people is how you go about deciding what repertoire you're going to play from year to year, because there's such a huge breadth of repertoire available to pianists.
Well, I think the fundamental thing is that you just play what you love. You know, you play what you're absolutely nuts about, and I think there's so much to love in the huge piano repertoire that there's very little point in playing anything that you don't. You know, I think it's what I try to do with programs is of course you want to draw sort of certain connections between pieces, but also I mean what fascinates me is how you can hear something that you think you know quite well in a different light when it's next to something that's less familiar. You know, I mean that's it's like I know it's hard to describe, but there's something that happens in a performance, you know, when you've put certain pieces together that I think can that can just sort of illuminate it in a way that you know that wouldn't otherwise when you're not in that live situation. And it's one of the reasons I think, you know, so many things that this pandemic's highlighted, but it's one of the reasons why live performance is so important. You know, it's the real thing. And like many of us, I'm just desperate to to get back to it as soon as possible.
It's interesting what you say about listening differently. I mean, one of the things that we have talked about in Music in the Round a lot is about how to program contemporary music, and how if you program certain contemporary composers, you know, with Beethoven or with Schubert or whatever, it changes the way you listen to the Beethoven and the contemporary piece, if you like.
Yeah.
It sort of it sort of opens your ears in a slightly different way, particularly if you know if there are any particular connections. But do you think that's the same with any music? I mean, if you were to put Weber with Beethoven, that would change the way you listen to Weber and Beethoven, for example, or does it depend on the time that it's written?
I think it can, because music, like, you know, everything else in the world, always comes from somewhere. You know, contemporary music might seem you know, to some people might seem intimidating and something that's inaccessible, but it didn't just appear out of nowhere. It's come, you know, it's come from somewhere, and it's come from something that is actually more familiar to those people. And I think if you can program in a way that draws attention to that, and then the contemporary music actually makes more sense, you know. And I think intelligent programming of contemporary music is really important for that reason.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Let's get onto the program that you've put down this year, that you've recorded for us. Can you explain some of the rationale behind it? Because it's very familiar composers, but the Schubert sonata you're playing is not necessarily as familiar to people as some of the others might be, whereas the Mozart sonata will be very familiar. Is that a deliberate idea of having unfamiliar and familiar, but with very, very famous composers, or was that not in your thinking, really?
I think I've got to come clean about this. There's not much rationale, really, because everything in the past year has been so disjointed. You know, I put together a program which was going to be my main recital program for this year, which was Mendelssohn's Songs Without Words, the Mozart Sonata, the 331, Last Scriabin Preludes, and Mussorgsky Pictures, and there was a rationale. You know, there were sort of various thoughts behind that. you have pictures and exhibition, so pictures without images, really, pictures in sounds, and songs without words. I mean, and I felt that in some way Scriabin was to Mussorgsky that Mendelssohn is to Mozart. And I just kind of wanted to draw attention to that as well. But of course, that's all been blown out of the water with everything, because we're not doing full recitals, and we haven't for a year. So everything has become so disjointed, and I think what I've tried to do is just try to sort of even things out, because the Schubert B major sonata was in a different program later in the year, and actually I just felt, with this stopping and starting that we're all experiencing now, of no performing for months and then suddenly doing something. I'm someone that needs to just keep at it. I need to feel like I'm in the swing of it, and I just need to play these pieces. So I'm afraid that there's not a huge kind of rationale behind these pieces, apart from the fact that they're just all wonderful pieces. The Mozart Adagio is, of course, one of his most it's extraordinary. It's one of his most personal and introspective and anguished pieces. Yeah, and I think probably relates to what quite a lot of us are feeling at the moment, and it's sort of there's something almost relentless or sort of unforgiving about it until the very last line, where you just get a sense of hope of something else. So I think in that way it's fairly topical for our time. The 331. That there is a connection there, because I think there's something very Schubertian about the trio in the middle movement. Absolutely. The minuet and trio. Something in that kind of inward-looking and harmonically extraordinary world, which does look towards Schubert. And the B major, which, like you say, is one of Schubert's. It's not one of the most played of Schubert's sonatas. But at least for me, of the early sonatas, we can call them the pre-syphilis sonatas, the pre 7/8.
There's a marketing tag for you.
Where he got that diagnosis and everything changed in his music.
Exactly.
So we're not at that point, and that kind of despair and hopelessness, I guess, at this stage in Schubert's life is more of a sense of longing, the zings of longing for something. And that's certainly there in this piece, but there's something experimental about it. It's like, in the way it's laid out, certainly the first movement, I can't find any precedence for it. It doesn't seem to relate to anything, and it doesn't, nor does it sort of influence anything as far as I can see. It's really a unique piece of music, and I think for that reason, it might. I think it's quite difficult in performance to sort of glue it together, because it does have a slightly sort of disjointed sense, but there's that feeling of just sort of breaking ground and being experimental, which is you don't necessarily associate with Schubert, but he was that composer too.
The temptation at that stage, particularly with composers who famously were influenced by Beethoven, is to think that there's some connection to Beethoven. There's nothing very obvious in this piece, as you say, that's connected to anything else. Is there anything in the sort of compositional process, or anything that you can see that relates to? You say it's experimental in a way that we often say Beethoven was experimental, but I mean, it doesn't feel like Beethoven. It doesn't sound like Beethoven. It doesn't have the same processes as Beethoven. Is there any connection at all, or is that just a dead end, do you think?
I can't see any connection at all to Beethoven. 20 years ago, when I did the Schubert sonata series for the first time.
I remember it very well.
Yes. It was 20 years ago. In fact, just a few days ago, I don't know, I've got 5th of May in my mind, which was the date that I played the last 3 Schubert sonatas.
I was there.
At the Wigmore.
Yeah. I
remember
20
years ago. But I remember going into that thinking, maybe I'll kind of wondering what I'll learn, what I discover about Schubert, and kind of expecting to find connections with Beethoven. And I came out of the year basically just seeing more of the differences between Beethoven and Schubert. And I mean, I really can't find any sort of obvious thread from Beethoven there. I mean, the first movement is basically 4 distinct ideas with very little development. And the development section is kind of focused on one of those ideas mainly. And the development is really through the sort of most bizarre and unexpected harmonic direction, which is quite Schubertian, but you know, there's very little of that kind of sort of animalistic development that you get.
My brother's called Julian Horton. He's professor in Durham in music, mainly 19th century music. He had a very interesting thing to say once about the difference between Beethoven and Schubert in sonata form, particularly, which is with Beethoven, there's an inevitability. There's this sort of goal-directedness. There's a thread. You can see exactly this. You know where it's going. It's always inevitable. It's going to go there. With Schubert, you're here, and then you can step over there. You can step over there. You can step over there. You come back maybe, and you still get to the end, and there's still a feeling of satisfaction at the end, or whatever it happens to be. But there's no logical development in the same way. It's more like I don't know what the best word is, but it's more like a sort of a meandering, if you like, through some ideas rather than inevitability.
It's like Alfred Brendell's comment, isn't it, that Schubert writes with the assurance of a sleepwalker. You know, it's a sort of does get to the destination, but you know, it's exactly that thing with Beethoven, that you always know where you're going. Beethoven always knows exactly where he's headed. And you don't quite get that sense with Schubert.
For years and years and years and years, I struggled with Schubert, and I was terrified of Schubert. I just didn't play any sonatas because I just found it really hard. I didn't know how it went. I was never quite convinced by, I loved them, and I have since I was a child, but I found it quite terrifying. And I'm wondering whether it's because of that, because there isn't that inevitability. You have to be very convinced by a character at any particular moment. Of course you do in Beethoven, but you know that that's always connected to the next thing in a very specific way. Do you find preparing Beethoven and Schubert, for example, a very different process because of that, the way they write?
It is very different. I think there's something more reassuring about Beethoven, because the whole direction of Beethoven is to find a solution at the end, to resolve in some way. And Schubert, on the other hand, is happy not to resolve. And sometimes you get of a great piece of Schubert, and you've got more questions than you had when you started, and there's never that kind of that feeling of okay, we're headed in this direction and we're going to find an answer. And in that sense, Schubert is I don't know, it's just there's far more vulnerability about Schubert music than there is about Beethoven. And of course, there's so many sides of Beethoven, and there's great tenderness and great sensitivity, even if we sort of focus on the more dramatic and forceful sides of his character, but there is all that too. But with Schubert, there's something, I'd say, almost sort of more human about it, because the fact is we don't have the answers to everything. And Schubert is happy to sort of to leave that for us.
It's sort of unself-consciously vulnerable, if you like. Absolutely. Which I suppose maybe that's why I found it difficult, because it's almost too close to the bone sometimes to get to the nitty-gritty of it. And just thinking about sorry, I don't want to spend the whole time talking about Schubert, but although I'd love to, but we'll probably talk about other things. But just thinking about as you say, the pre-syphilis diagnosis and the post, do you see any difference in obviously there's a difference maybe in the character. I mean, post-diagnosis, there's always something niggling around there. There's always something slightly painful, or almost always. I mean, last minute of the G major sonata, I wouldn't say is painful. It's pretty carefree in many ways. But a lot of the time, there's something like that trill in the last sonata. There's something slightly unpleasant about a lot of it. Do you think? Can you see a difference of process in the way that he writes before that diagnosis and afterwards, or is it very clearly the same composer?
I think it's the same composer, basically, just in a different mindset, but the same composer. I don't think there's any more or less obvious direction to the way he composes. I think this sleepwalker type approach to sort of eventually finding your way somewhere is there before and after. It's just that afterwards it's just way more stark, and there's a brutality about post-diagnosis Schubert, the sparseness of it, even the anger, sometimes the terror and the anger. Of course, you think of the obvious places like the middle of the slow movement of 959, and 784, and the other A minor sonata, the other big A minor sonata 845. The coda to the first movement is
terrifying.
Is absolutely terrifying. And angry. And just shaking your fist at the world.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. I thought we'd get on to now. I just want to. I don't want to embarrass you, but a lot of people might not realise this, but when you were at school, you played a lot of big, romantic, a lot of Russian music, a lot of Rachmaninoff, Prokofiev. You said the other day you came across this program with Islame in it, and by Balakirev, this huge sort of monumental, incredibly difficult thing. Now, as a pianist, as a musician, you're very well connected. You're associated with Central European, mainly sort of Austro-Germanic music, which is not to say you don't play other things. I know you play Chopin occasionally, and you play Mussorgsky, and you were putting down Scriabin and whatever. Are you ever tempted to go back to a lot of things like Rachmaninoff concertos or Islame or any of these big Russian beasts that you used to play so amazingly when we were at school? I remember.
I've got the recordings to prove that it wasn't that good, actually.
Yeah, but you were 16. I'm sure it was good for a 16-year-old. Think what you could do with it now.
Yeah, I think I'd be too terrified to play some of it now.
I'm sure.
Yeah, I am tempted, and occasionally I take it off the shelf and have a bash through. I mean, Islame, I did put that up on the music stand and look through that sometime. It was one of the lockdowns last year, and it kind of went back on the shelf about 20 minutes later. It's not because I don't like it.
Yeah.
I think you kind of. You get to a stage where you just sort of have to be honest about what you think you can do better than other things. I'm not sure that's really. While I'm tempted, I'd love to come back to Tchaikovsky First Piano Concerto, because that's a great piece, and
a really great piece.
Yeah, and I had such fun playing it. Other things, I start to sort of put my fingers through and think, oh, this will be fun, and then after an hour or two, think, actually, I want to play music that I know I'm never going to be bored with, and just sort of practicing things technically. Okay, it's sort of something to aim at and something to work for and all of that. But in the end, I just think there's music that, at least to me, is more interesting, and it's sort of never attainable things that I find more interesting, and that's what I want to focus.
Yes. Is there any music that you never thought you would play that you've come to later, that you suddenly think, because you don't play a huge amount of Chopin? I know you have played some, for example. Is there anything like that, or Scriabin? I remember at school you used to play a lot of Scriabin as well, I think I'm right in saying, and you've come back to that. Is there anything that you are now thinking, well, maybe 2, 3, 4 years in the future, I might look at this, whatever, whether it be it contemporary or not? Or do you not, do you just prefer to revisit things that that you feel comfortable with?
No, I always want to look at new things, and it's sort of, I'm going to be 50 next year.
Oh God.
Which it just seems crazy. And I'm thinking, it kind of gets to that point where you think, all right, I've got to get serious about, what have I not learned? Because, that learning process, as we all know, it just gets a bit harder as we get older. there's a lot of French music that I haven't played. I used to play more French music at school as well, but I just haven't. I've played, I think, over the years, probably less French music than Russian, in my student days. And in lockdown last year, I did actually learn. I sort of learned Estampe, Debussy Estampe, and the Ravel G major concerto, and things that I'd never learned. And I thought, I'd just love to play that. Just before the pandemic hit, I was doing a program with Stephen Osborne of French duet music, which is
of course,
it was such fun. I sort of loved the repertoire, and at that point I thought, I want to play more of this stuff.
Really. I've been relearning the Debussy Image, both books of Image, which I'm playing in Sheffield during the festival, and I'm also learning for the first time the second book of Preludes, Debussy Preludes. And I have to say, it's like a breath of fresh air. There's something, I can't quite put my finger on what it is. There's something, first of all, there's sort of something about the color of it and the different colors that you can explore, which is very, very different from a Germanic type of writing, which is, it's a very different process to learn and to, make decisions and whatever. There isn't that same, we're talking about Beethoven, that same inevitability about rigor. I mean, it's rigorous in its own way, but it's not, it's not the sort of goal-directedness in the same way. And I find it such a breath of fresh air. I'm just thinking now, I just want to play Debussy for the rest of my life. It just feels so much fun,
I think, if you play a lot of that Germanic music, coming to French music, it feels quite liberating in a way. You can just sort of color and characterize, and I mean that's sort of the main thing, really. And it's as if you've sort of you've just sort of liberated yourself from a certain way of thinking, which is, it's quite refreshing in a sense.
A lot of people, I'm sure, who know about your association with Alfred Brendel would probably be a little bit disappointed if I didn't ask you about that association. You met him, I think, when you were still at Guildhall, is that right? Did he come and do some masterclasses or something?
Yeah. Could
you just, I think the audience might be interested to know just how that relationship developed.
I was a third-year student at Guildhall, and he came at quite short notice to give a masterclass in January '93, I remember, and I played him Haydn E-flat, the last E-flat sonata. Of course, terrified and just expecting the worst. But afterwards he said, well, let's keep in touch, and sort of went to play to him maybe from then to the end of the 90s about 5-6 times every year. Of course, sort of mainly his repertoire as well, which was, I guess, also a kind of influence in the direction I took repertoire-wise. I just think, actually, you met him before I did, didn't you? Because you played concerto to him before. It was before 3.
It was when I was 17, actually. I went to play to him. It's quite a funny story. I was playing the Schoenberg Piano Concerto at Chetham's and with the school orchestra. And I was having a lesson with my teacher at the time. And he just suddenly stopped. He said, give me a minute. And about half an hour later, he came back. He said, you're going to play this to Alfred Brendel on Sunday. And somehow, I mean, he'd got hold of Alfred Brendel's number. He'd sorted out. He'd said, I've got this young guy who's doing the Schoenberg Concerto, which used to be one of Brendel's. I should just explain, by the way, sorry, just in brackets, that I'm assuming everyone knows who Alfred Brendel is, but there may be, well, I mean, there may be a lot of people watching this who have no idea. Alfred Brendel is now in his 90s, isn't he? And he retired about 13 years ago, I think it was, from playing. He was one of the great pianists really of the last sort of half century, 60 years, just to explain. And a very venerable character and wonderful sort of musical brain. Anyway, so I went to play in the Schoenberg Concerto when I was 17. So yes, that's the first time I met him.
Yeah, not, assuming everyone knows who Alfred Brendel is. I think he was 78 when he played his last concert in Vienna. And I'm sort of hearing a story that the year after that, he was at some award. He was getting some lifetime achievement award. I don't know from which organization. But he was on a table with Jason Donovan, and asked him, so what do you do then? And Alfred said, I used to be a pianist. It was kind of, the understatement of the century.
Just to sort of explore that a little bit more, what was it that you, I mean, this is such a huge question, but are there any things that you could explain that you learnt from Brendel, or that I don't know whether "learn from" is the right expression, but that you got from those lessons?
Overall, it was just that fantastic example of someone who was a musician first, and the fact that he happened to be a great pianist was actually just not the most important thing.
Yeah.
I mean, having the opportunity to see close up how he sort of created sound and color, you know, the articulate, use certain kinds of attack and articulation in combination with, you know, sort of very intricate pedaling. I mean, he was such a great master of the pedal, the way he used the pedal. You know, and sometimes when he'd explain things, and you sort of take it on board, and then he'd demonstrate, and then a light would go on. You think, yeah, that's exactly. I see it now. I get what he's talking about. I mean, could you put your finger on it yourself? Or
I think I spent my entire life up to that point thinking of playing the piano. You know, being a pianist. That's, you know, you master your instrument, I think suddenly someone who sort of thinks about anything but the piano, if you like, you know, I mean, he would always talk about other colors, you know, orchestral sound, you know, how to play like an oboe, how to play like a human voice, how to play all these things that I just had never even vaguely thought of before that point. I have to confess, though, there's one thing that I did find really difficult at the time. His musical voice is such a strong musical voice, but so individual. I mean, you can hear 2 bars of Arthur Brendell playing anything, and you know it's him immediately. Yeah. But the thing I struggled with was getting past that voice and finding my own voice. I think, in a way, the temptation is to copy when it's someone like that, and not just copy the technique and the way, as you say, that combination of pedaling and you know, whatever, but also the sort of the way of actually phrasing and of you know, of interpreting sort of agogic markings and whatever. I think it took me a long time to realize that you're not supposed to copy what he does. You're supposed to use it as a starting point to opening up your own imagination. I don't know whether you have the same process, but
and I think that took a bit of time, really, to sort of realize that, and then sort of find a way, or at least just allow the time that was needed to be able to translate the influences into my own language, you know, because the end, you absolutely, you can't copy someone. I mean, it's, you know, it's of course it's difficult when, like you say, you have a musician with such a huge personality and of such a distinct character, and in his sound, in his whole approach to music. But in a way, it just took a bit of time to step back from that and to sort of look at the broader direction, the broader influences, and kind of take that on board in a way that's kind of sounded relevant to my own, you know, musical personality, I suppose, because otherwise, you end up being a sort of a pale copy.
Can you identify any other musical influences that have been particularly strong, pianists or otherwise, that you would say are people that you've really that have been or continue to be strong musical influences?
All my most valued and respected musical colleagues, of which you are absolutely you know, at the top of that list. I mean, really, I listen to, and the people I trust, and you know, and I think that's really, it's an important thing actually to have those people that you do kind of trust, and whose, you know, whose ears you can rely on if you need to. I think it gets to a point where to you know, of course you have to kind of be your own teacher, but you need to keep that also in check in a way, and I think to have the right kind of influences around you, better than your friends, really.
Exactly, I couldn't agree more. And I think that actually, talking about Brendell and the opening up of imagination, I think the even stronger influence for me has been playing with people. I mean, the people in the ensemble and whoever else, and listening to people like yourself and going to concerts. That's been even more of an influence, really. Realizing, just looking at, I mean, from a pianistic point of view, looking exactly, you know, if I see how you go about that passage and physically and musically, and you suddenly think, oh, I hadn't thought of that. Not that I would ever want to copy again, but also just how your imagination can be released by the influence of others. You know, you're sitting in a practice room for so long and you're thinking, how does this go? You know? And then you go and rehearse the Brahms piano quintet or whatever, and someone says something really often quite simple, but it opens up another world that you hadn't realized before. You know? So absolutely, I couldn't agree more. Sort of colleagues.
Otherwise, you can just sort of drive yourself crazy in your own internal world. And I think to have colleagues to bounce off is really important. Yeah.
I thought end by talking about the obvious, really, which is, I mean, obviously about a year and a bit ago, everything stopped. You've already said that you decided to learn a few things that you hadn't learned before, like the Ravel G major concerto and whatever. We talked a little while ago about because ever since I think July, when I did my first online concert, since the pandemic hit, I've been playing to a microphone for nearly a year now. And I'm sure my relationship with microphones has changed in some ways. But it's a slightly leading question, because I remember talking to you about this, but what do you feel is the difference between playing to an audience knowing it's being recorded for radio, playing without an audience in a recording studio, and what we're going through at the moment? You know, what are the processes? What are the sort of, you know, your ways of approaching these things?
I think, well, I suppose if we sort of call sort of playing without an audience for a microphone, we call that recording. You know, I've always felt that, you know, when I've gone into the studio to do a recording, I've tried to treat it as far as I can like a live performance. And in some cases, remember certain recordings where we sort of got things in the can, you know, got to a point where I think, okay, we've got it now. And then the producer and sound engineer come and sit in the hall while I sort of play the whole thing through. And if, you know, even to an audience of 2 people, it feels like a performance. And quite often, you know, well, at least to some extent, that's what's ended up on the CD, or sort of, you know, parts of that. But I think recording is a completely different discipline from playing to people in a space. With recording, I think, as far as the microphones are concerned, the microphones are listening to detail. You know, they're sort of picking up detail that is basically inaudible from, you know, the third row back in most concert halls, and that's fine. You know, it's a different thing, and I think to be able to get that level of detail on a recording is great, but it's just not the same thing. In a live performance situation, you know, you couldn't possibly, you know, you can't leave wrong notes in a recording from a commercial studio recording. There are always wrong notes in performance. And the point is that it doesn't matter, because that's not how people are listening. They're not just listening to sound, they're having an experience. They're having a physical experience that's there in the hall. And it completely changes the way we listen. And also changes the way we play. Because what we do, it is an interaction. It's exactly what you said. And it's all about that interaction. Exactly. And what's important about it can only be experienced with that interaction. It's like we're sort of doing it, but taking the interaction out of it. It's crazy, really. And
it's funny, because I've always, when I play solo stuff, I do get very nervous. I find it a very nerve-wracking experience. I also love it, and I love the process of preparing. And it's, you know, it is a terrifying thing to do in a way, you know, to go on stage and play great music to a lot of people. It's also a wonderful thing to do, and it can be incredibly exhilarating. But as you say, with the microphone, it's not exhilarating in that. It's a different experience. It can be fun as well, but it's not the same thing. So
no.
I want to say thank you for joining me today. It's a very great pleasure to talk to you again.
That's great to chat.
Yeah, exactly. It's been a little while. And thank you for recording the concert. It's on Friday, 14th of May. And this little chat will be broadcast then. And then afterwards, we'll hear Paul playing Mozart and Schubert. So thank you very much. I hope everyone enjoyed this talk and this little discussion, and enjoy the festival.